Hello and welcome to another video getting you grades 7, 8 and 9 for your poetry comparisons. Today, as you know, we're focusing on Kamikaze, and as usual there will be just 5 quotations. Here they are highlighted in yellow for you so you can get a taste of what is to come, and that's it. That's all you need to get the grade. As usual, I'll show you how to organise your comparison using the Foss way, form opening, the language features, the structure and the ending. Straight in to see if we can make this video super short. Now, who's talking to who in this poem is super confusing. So this is my best way of explaining it. It's about a daughter talking about her father, who is the kamikaze pilot, and she's telling her own children. But she doesn't start telling her own children till after this line. So this is some information from the poet, its backstory. The poem begins, her father embarked at sunrise with a flask of water, a samurai sword. Now the way I've read that is to emphasize the sibilance. So this repeated S sound gives it a sign of peace. And that peaceful sound reflects the peace that he's supposed to find in death. That's also symbolized with sunrise, sun symbolizing both the country of Japan, that's why the sun is the symbol on their flag, and it also symbolizes divinity. It's like meeting God. Water is always a symbol of purity, and so he's purifying himself spiritually this way, and also for a Christian audience, for us, it also signifies baptism. He's dying in order to enter into new life as a hero. Then we have this wonderful word embarked. It literally means to get on a boat. A bark is a boat, and that's being used deliberately here because it's going to be the site of the grandfather's boat, so the father's boat, that reminds him what it's like to be at sea, what it's like to be a fisherman, and persuades him not to kill other sailors on the sea. So ultimately the father is going to realize the enemy is just like him. And also his father's boat will remind him of the family that he's losing, and therefore he chooses not to die. So this first stanza are the facts of his journey, or the beginning of his journey, and now this line break here shows us the thoughts of the daughter as she reimagines what was going through her father's head. So even though her father, when she was a child, became dead to her, she still formed this amazing intellectual bond with him, where she's trying to imagine his thoughts and experiences. So she imagines him looking down on schools of fish. The fish themselves are obviously symbols of life, and this is the life he doesn't want to give up by committing suicide. Now the simile she uses is revealing. The fish are like a huge flag waved first one way and then the other in a figure of 8. So the flag, of course, represents patriotism. So on the one hand, these fish represent life, but on the other, they represent the sacrifice that he's supposed to make patriotically for his country, for the flag. Many readers have picked up on this idea of the figure of 8 on its side. I'll just trace it with my mouse here, and this is the symbol for infinity. So at this moment he's imagining his death and presumably living forever immortally as a hero. But at the same time, infinity is eternal death, and so he's also imagining the absence of life forever. We can also say that the figure of 8 returns on itself. So what we have here is a physical representation of how he's going to fly out to commit suicide, change his mind, and then come back. And that's also reflected in the language. He flies first one way and then the other in returning. So this is the moment where he begins to change his mind, according to his daughter. This stanza describes everything that would be on the father's boat, and so the daughter is thinking, yes, that was my grandfather's boat, but she's saying that to her children, This is like a reply. The children have interrupted when they're talking about the boat, and she's saying, yes, that's grandfather's boat, which would be her children's grandfather, which would be her father. So that line suggests that the daughter has then established a relationship with her father, who becomes the children's grandfather, who they still talk to. So he's obviously inherited the boat, and his relationship with the family has completely changed. Now, I've studied this poem many times, and nobody ever points this out. The conventional interpretation of this poem is that the father lives a kind of living death because his family refused to talk to him, as we shall see. However, it seems that this daughter has changed that for her own children. She has allowed them to have a grandfather, her father. So let's focus on what he sees on the boat according to his daughter. The white bait are a kind of fish, and they are silver in colour, but the choice of language describing them as loose silver is an allusion to a biblical description. So in the West, silver has always represented the idea of betrayal, because Judas Iscariot, one of the 12 disciples, betrayed Jesus to the Romans in return for 30 pieces of silver. And that's referenced, if you like, in loose, the idea of loose morality as well as loose coins. So she invites us to imagine these loose coins at the same time as she describes the colour and movement of the fish being released onto the boat's deck. So the white bait symbolise his betrayal of his country, just as Judas betrayed Jesus. Now the dark prince, muscular and dangerous, that is the tuna fish, is another symbol, and it's more difficult to work out what that signifies. It could signify the Japanese royal family, who are effectively condemning these men to go to their deaths, to sacrifice themselves for their country and for their emperor. But equally, it could symbolise the subversive act that her father does by not killing himself. And so his act, his protest against throwing his life away pointlessly, is, it turns out to be, a dark and princely act. It's a positive way of looking at what he's done. He's punished by society because what he's done is dangerous, but it's not a weak decision, it's a muscular one, it's a strong one. Now that interpretation only works if we think that the narrator, the daughter, has now welcomed her father back into the family to be a grandfather to her own children. If you don't take that point of view, then this has to represent the Japanese royal family, who are dangerous to the samurai because they cause their deaths. Now I do favour the idea that she has brought her father back into the family, and it's because of these two quotations. So, only we children still chattered and laughed. So that means that they loved their father, they were grateful to have him back, and that is the natural human reaction. Garland then introduces a line break for a new stanza till we get this volta, this turn. Till gradually we too learned to be silent. The word gradually, I think, shows us how unnatural it was for the children to disown their father. They couldn't do it suddenly. And so this implies that the Japanese culture at the time is doing something painful and wrong, and it takes a long time for the children to adjust to it. And the fact that they learned it also suggests it was totally unnatural. This invites us to imagine that as this child, the daughter, grows up, she's now reflecting back on her childhood and thinking that decision was wrong. And sometimes, she said, he must have wondered which had been the better way to die. So the phrase "he must have wondered" means the daughter has never spoken to her father about his decision, even though he's lived many years afterwards, because the memory is too painful for him. The last line, "which had been the better way to die," suggests that he's died emotionally within the family, which is problematic. It suggests that he's never been accepted back. The family have permanently ostracised him. But as we've seen, when she says to her children, yes, that was grandfather's boat, that can't work because her children's grandfather is her father. Therefore, the last line doesn't mean he has faced an ultimate death, excluded by his family. That death only lasted while his own wife was alive. Perhaps the other children have still not accepted him, but this daughter has, because she's retelling the story to her own children. Now, I think Beatrice Garland makes this chronology about who's talking to who through the generations really complicated to try and show how complex culture can be and how damaging it can be to the family through the generations. But it's also a message of hope. You know, how do countries and people recover from a war? Well, it's the next generation, the ones who weren't alive during the war, who rebuild that country and who change the culture and have different points of view. And that's quite a profound question. If you take the case of Japan, it was the only country bombed with atomic bombs, and it was actually bombed twice, Hiroshima and Nagasaki, in 1945, and yet by the 1970s, Japan had become an economic superpower. And so just as Japan did not die after this amazing level of destruction, so the father, the children's grandfather, also did not actually die. So my reading when we get to the ending is that this is actually a poem about hope, about how cultures can change and they don't have to be locked into the old way of doing things. We could even argue that losing the war has enabled this culture to change and become something much better than it was. So this would be my only positive poem about war in the anthology, you know, because the culture has become much more celebratory of life rather than being willing to sacrifice it through the tradition of the samurai. Right, let's return to the Fosse and see how we've approached it. Well, obviously we've got the poet's point of view at the beginning, which I've covered, and at the end, which I've covered. Everything I've mentioned about the chronology, about who's speaking about who, that's structure. Every time I've looked at those two line breaks between stanzas, that's you analysing structure as well. The language features we've done all the way through using the words symbol and simile, which we had here. And next, for the grade 7, we need to consider the analysis of form. So that's quite difficult to write about in this poem. We'll see that each stanza is 6 lines long, but I can't think of an actual reason for this. It doesn't relate to the subject matter of the poem in any way. It's written in free verse, entirely without rhyme. And I guess the easiest thing we can say about that is it feels like natural speech. It's as though this becomes a monologue from He Must Have Looked Far Down as she speaks to her children. Perhaps we can say this makes it feel more like a narrative, a story that she's telling, with a moral at the end of it, which is that we shouldn't kill our members of our own family. Instead, we should do the opposite and give them life and protection. Or I suppose we could argue that the poem doesn't really have a form which reflects the way the family did not give the father his true form as a father. They denied him that identity. And then we could say that the poem is attempting to develop a form with these regular 6-line stanzas, which could reflect how she's trying to give a new identity, a new form to her father by establishing him as the grandfather to her own children. So, you know, I struggle with this sometimes because 20th century poets and 21st century poets often deliberately ignore form because they're trying to do something new. And so what I've given you is strictly for the exam. So remember, your tactic in the exam is to write about the form first, because that anchors the examiner's expectation that you're a grade 7 student or above, because that's where form enters the mark scheme. And with your second poem, you'll also follow this same pattern. It's a really easy way to talk about the author's purpose, because it's always revealed at the opening and then it always changes by the ending, as we saw particularly in this poem, where we get the daughter's new perspective on her father, where she reintroduces him to her own children and he becomes a grandfather. It's very likely that you haven't followed this narrative about who is talking to who in the same way in your own lessons. Teachers find it really difficult to work out who it is that's talking to who about who. And I've had that same difficulty, but I've given it probably an hour of thinking and research, and that's the best I can do. So I hope that makes sense for you. If you would like more, as usual, don't forget to give me the comments underneath, and don't forget to subscribe. See you soon on my channel.